Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Black Mind Garden, where we are remapping minds so you can create a life you design. I'm Dr. Maisha, I'm your host. And, today I was thinking about this idea of having a high tolerance and whether it is a signal for resilience or whether it's a tip off for trauma or both. And I'm going to take you on a little thought journey that happened today that had me come and record this podcast immediately afterwards. Today, I was getting some body work done, had some chiropractic work done, had some body work done because your host, she does practices martial arts. I practice Kung Fu, as you probably know, I probably mentioned on previous podcasts. And this week, upon returning to Kung Fu, this week we were doing mat work. And so what that means is we were throwing and being thrown. Your girl's 38, or excuse me, 40 and slip. Your girl's 48-year-old body, when thrown, sometimes things can get misaligned. And so I scheduled my appointment this morning for chiropractic and for the body work. So I'm laying on the table and my therapist is doing, he's doing the deep work, and I like very deep work done because I'm an athlete and I like to get all of those knots and the adhesions and the muscles like untangled, and my body work person does a very, very, very good job of that. So as I'm on the table, as a therapist would, he would ask from time to time, are you okay? Is everything okay? And I would say yes. And after a moment, after a few times that he asked me that question, I started to wonder how other people responded to work this deep and other people's tolerance for pain. Because I've always said, well, I have this high tolerance for pain. And then as I thought about this phrase of high tolerance for pain, or this idea of high tolerance for pain, I started to think, well, is it, do I have a high tolerance? Why do I have a high tolerance for pain? And the first thing that came to mind is, what is it? Because I'm a Black woman? Is it because I'm a woman, period, who's had a child? And then of course, when I the thought of me being a Black woman, am I perpetuating a stereotype? The not the stereotype, but the false belief that Black people don't feel pain the same way as people of European descent. So there were a lot of thoughts that went through my head in that moment. But then as I moved forward in my thinking about this high tolerance, as I was going down the thought rabbit hole, I thought to myself, this is an interesting thought, having a high tolerance, because some, at least in my upbringing, having a high tolerance for pain was sort of worn as a badge of honor, like a badge of strength. And I was thinking about that, like, well, I wonder why that is. And then I started to think about a high tolerance, people who had high tolerance for stress and high tolerance for other things. Now, sometimes when people think about high tolerance, they think about alcohol. And this whole idea of having a high tolerance sometimes is worn as a badge of honor, sometimes, or not a badge of honor, but a badge of strength, a badge of resilience. But as I started to think about it, I think about, what is the implication behind having a high tolerance? Someone who has a high tolerance, and let's think about this for a moment, because if you talk about a person who drinks alcohol and that person says, well, I have a high tolerance for alcohol, typically that means that maybe they have a high tolerance because they're used to drinking it. So they consume enough alcohol to where their tolerance has raised. Now, one thing we know is that alcohol damages the liver. And so it's a damage that you cannot see, but the higher the tolerance, the higher the consumption, the more inflammation that happens in the liver. And over time, that inflammation can turn into scarring, and it can turn into cirrhosis, and it can cause disease throughout the body. And for some can cause, and for many can cause death. And so alcoholic cirrhosis is a function of someone consuming large amounts of alcohol over time. But a person who consumes that amount of alcohol over time develops a tolerance. Now, if you think about this and you map this on to other things, so let's say someone says they have a high tolerance for stress. Well, that presupposes that they experience a lot of stress. And that is not necessarily a good thing. And stress, just like alcohol, does damage that people cannot see. It can have a mental, emotional, damaging impact, and it can also have a physical impact. We know that stress causes inflammation in the body. And so when people are stressed, they're more prone, their immune systems are less capable of fighting off disease. Their bodies are less capable of healing. And so high tolerance for stress, presupposing that a person experiences so much stress that they begin to tolerate it, they begin to actually get used to it. Now, and even potentially become emotionally and psychologically numb to it is not a good thing. And then when we think about high tolerance for pain, well, that presupposes, and we could say physical pain, but we could also say high tolerance for emotional pain or psychological pain. And what that presupposes is a person has experienced a lot of pain in the past, enough pain in the past to which that it has moderated their experience of pain. Why did I go down this whole thought rabbit hole? It's because as a person who is trauma informed, trauma responses, who teaches this work, I think about, well, what does that mean? If someone who is constantly experiencing stress, constantly experiencing pain, whether it's physical or emotional, over time, when someone is experiencing unrelenting stressors, whether they be physical, psychological, or emotional, then it becomes toxic. So we talk about this idea or this spectrum, the stress to trauma continuum, right? We talk about stress in this window of tolerance. And so when a person is experiencing so much stress that they have to moderate their experience of it. Now, let's go back because there is healthy stress. This actually moves into the distinction of when is it resilience and when is it trauma? Like, when is it resilience and when is it an experience of trauma? And that's going to be individual for each. That is going to be different for each individual person. But if we think about this whole idea of the stress to trauma continuum, there is such a thing as healthy stress. But healthy stress is identified by there being a somewhat an end in sight, a light at the end of the tunnel. It is um, distinguished by having support systems in place, by having periods of rest and recovery. And so we can have stress in our lives and have those periods of rest and recovery. And could that increase our tolerance to stress? Absolutely. It could increase our tolerance. And that might be resilience. That might be what creates resilience, right? So that's what creates resilience when we do have that those periods of rest and recovery, those places of support around us that when we need we can lean on. That is where we have healthy stress. And even higher stress, even toxic stress for very short periods of time, if you know that there's an end and you do have the period of rest and recovery, and you do have those support systems surrounding you, even that can stretch our tolerance and can increase our resilience, our ability to bounce back, our ability to recover quickly. But it's when there aren't those support systems. It's when we don't have an ending in sight. It's when that there are no periods of rest and relaxation that toxic stress can also land or can move on to create a priming of the system, which then lands or manifests as trauma. It primes the fight or flight system and it has a person be hyper vigilant on a regular basis. And that is where we actually move over into this space of trauma. So, bringing it back to a high tolerance, the question Is it resilience or is it trauma? It actually depends. And so it's important when people talk about having a high tolerance to stress, a high tolerance to pain, a high tolerance to emotional stress, psychological stressors, that there is an awareness that while for some that could simply be resilience as a function of really pushing oneself and experiencing those healthy moments of stress, those healthy times of stress, and expanding themselves. For others, that high tolerance could be a function of trauma. It's interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend just the other day, and we were talking about this idea of resilience and how, particularly my generation as the X generation, has come into resilience. And even the generation above us, our baby boomer generation, and maybe even, of course, our silent generation, and especially in the Black community and other communities of who have been of marginalized identities, how resilience is bred in those communities has been historically as a function of trauma. It's been a function of force. It's been like you have to pick up and go, because you don't have time to have feelings. You don't have time to be stressed. You don't have time to break down, or whatever it is that looked like, or how it occurred in our older X Gen community, and in our community, our generations that came before us. And so, this idea of having a high tolerance, but having it be bred from trauma, is a little bit different from this paradigm of having healthy stressors with scaffold, with support systems, with periods of rest and recovery to expand our resilience in a healthy manner. And I think that's a very important thing to distinguish, particularly important when we're thinking about generations. If you're talking to a baby boomer and you're talking to a person who's of the X generation or an older generation who looks at a younger generation, or who talks about younger generations not having a lot of resilience, I say we have to look at ourselves as the older generation, because we create the generations below us. The resilience was sort of beaten into us in a way. It doesn't mean that's the right way to create resilience in our younger generations. We need to change the narrative, because it is true. It is absolutely necessary, I believe. This is my opinion, is that the younger generations, I mean, we have to teach them how to be resilient when raising our children, because out there in the world it requires it. And I think that one of the reasons that we are having such a mental health crisis, or two reasons, in our elder generation, is because we never talked about our feelings. We never talked about, so we hold that stuff in and we isolate, and then it gets too much, and then we're suffering. In the younger generation, I think because perhaps the older generations have shielded the younger generation so much that maybe it has taken away, we have maybe crossed this line of maybe taking away some of the resilience from that younger generation. So, and there's everything in between. So while we do need to we need to, as parents, be responsible that we help our children be resilient. We want to do it in a different way from the way we became resilient, for those of us who experienced trauma growing up. Okay, so we want to shift the narrative, and this is where legacy comes in. This is where we are changing or breaking cycles of trauma. However, that doesn't mean that having a high tolerance is a bad thing. The question is, how did one come into that high tolerance? Whether it's a high tolerance for physical pain, women who have gone through natural childbirth, or have gone through any kind of birth, childbirth, who have delivered, who have brought children into the world. We have a level of high tolerance for things like pain and discomfort, because, well, we have to carry a kid in our bodies for however long we're, 9, 10 months. And for those who give birth, I mean, that is a a very intense process and painful process. Even if you know, get a C-section, the recovery from that, there is a level of tolerance for pain that you develop when you have to have surgery. So someone who has a chronic illness or who's had multiple surgeries develops a high tolerance for pain. And so that's different from someone who maybe was physically abused as a child. And that, unfortunately, that creates a high tolerance for physical and emotional and psychological pain because of having to go numb or having to cope or whatever the person has to do in order to make it or survive that circumstance. When someone says, I have a high tolerance, or when you're saying you have a high tolerance, or when you're thinking about having a high tolerance, start to think about, well, how did you come into that high tolerance? And when you hear someone say that, begin to have the awareness of, well, high tolerance, it could be a factor just of resilience of life experiences of, hearing no and accepting rejection and continuing to move forward, but also be aware that it also could be a function of trauma, and you never know which it is. And that's why it's so important to always be listening through and looking through the lens of trauma. That is why it's important to be trauma responsive. And that's why it's important to look at people's reactions and listen to people's reactions and responses, because that also could give you a clue. A person who is maybe very stoic and their tolerance is high until it's not, until there is the proverbial straw that um, that breaks the camel's back, right? So I think that it's important for us to listen, and I talk about this often. I talk about listening as an equity practice and listening to create psychological safety and listening beyond the words, listening with our eyes so that we can begin to interact and connect with people on a deeper level and create that safety and assist others in moving through challenging, activating moments and understanding that trauma has a universality to it. While it may not seem, and this is again, it speaks to resilience and tolerance, where it may not seem like for some people what is happening is traumatic. You don't know what's happened in a person's background that could be an activator of their past experience that has left them with trauma in the mind and trauma in the body. So that's really what I wanted to share today because it was just an interesting thought pathway that I went down and really made me think about the language that we use and where does it come from. And I think that you know that if you follow me, you listen to me, if you've heard me talk, I'm a words girl, and words are important. Even though words are only 7% of our communication, we use a lot of words to communicate. And we also communicate beyond our words. We communicate with our tone of voice and our body language. But by and large, if you're not seeing someone, if you're hearing them, or if you are just learning how to listen with your eyes and listen with your body and your intuition, all you may be hearing is words. And so it's important to be listening for what are the clues? How can we better um, empower people in our communication? And what are the tip offs for people who may have histories of and be impacted by trauma in their past? So, with that, I will share that I have a course. If you are wondering, well, how do I expand my listening? How do I? And if you're on a team, or if you have an organization and you're like, well, how do we expand our listening? My course, Communication That Transforms, is all about expanding our capacity to listen, to communicate, and in a trauma responsive manner. If you are interested, I will have all of that information in the show notes. You can also reach out to me, Dr. Maisha at drmaisha.com, and you can go to the website here on your screen, mindremappingacademy.com, and on that homepage, you will actually see an opportunity to get access to a teaser of the course, a taster of the course. And you can also download an overview of what's inside the course that will allow you to see if this could be something that you want to go through personally, or if you want to test out for your team, your organization, and then maybe have your team go through the course. Because when I did my training, when I did a training recently with a group of executive leaders and was teaching them just a few tools, not even all of the tools that are in the course, it made such a huge difference, them expanding their listening and having the language to be able to navigate challenging situations, listening for and understanding, oh, this may be a clue about someone who's experienced trauma in their past, and being able to navigate and name and nurture that the person in that moment and even themselves in that moment. So the website is mindremappingacademy.com. If you're listening, you can go to the show notes. It will be there. And if you are thinking about the course, it's mindremappingacademy.com/TICC. That's Trauma Informed Communication course, TICC. So go check that out and share this episode with a friend. Share this episode with a colleague, with a family member, because I think it's important to understand this whole concept of having a high tolerance and what it could mean, and also to rethink how we create resilience in ourselves and in the generations that are coming behind us. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to the Black Mind Garden podcast on whichever platform you listen to podcasts, so that you will get notified whenever there's a new episode. So with that, if you're looking also, I will say, if you're looking for a speaker in your organization or in your community, in your church, in your company, in your healthcare organization, this is a lot of what I talk about. How do you create trauma responsiveness? How do you create psychological safety in your organization, especially by opening up and having a trauma responsive lens? So with that, you all have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. And as always, please stay empowered. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.